Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Spall, and I am on the board of directors of the Hawk Migration Association of North America and the executive council of the Niagara Peninsula Hawkwatch here in Ontario. Tonight, I'm going to be recording a version of a session talk, an informational session talk that I gave on September 1st for the Great Lakes Hawkwatch, with some minor additions that have happened since then, and updates, and basically for anybody who missed that talk. So first of all, thank you all for joining and tuning in to this video, and thanks especially for registering for the Great Lakes Hawkwatch. To start off, I'd like to thank all the wonderful organizations that and all the volunteers associated with those organizations that are helping to make this project happen through organizational meetings, coordinating counters and locations, doing emails and social media recruitment, and really they've just done an amazing amount of help. So once again, my name is Rob, and if you haven't had an email from me or from one of the other project organizers, then you certainly will soon. We'll be doing that to coordinate locations, avoid overlap of counters, team up mentors with potential mentees, and answer basic questions as they come up. So tonight I'll be going over a few essentials to help get registrants on the same page, but I won't be focusing on Raptor ID, as there are a lot of resources out there for that, and some of which I've already passed along to you. And likewise, I'll try to spare you the long stories of a grizzled old hawkwatcher and raptor bander, because frankly, nobody really tuned in for that. And I'll even avoid going into detail about all the amazing data, trends, and information that you can glean from hawkcount.org. But I am going to encourage you all to check it out sometime, because there really is a wealth of data on there, and you're about to contribute to it in a novel fashion through this project. So it's good to familiarize yourself with it. It'll help you find and strategize your visits to long-term monitoring sites near you, and it'll help answer a lot of questions you may have about raptor migration volume or timing across North America. Additionally, HawkCount fuels the Raptor Population Index, which is really the best standardized assessment of North America's raptor populations, and it's derived from community science collected data from folks like you all across the continent. So that's what I'm not going to talk about. Mostly, I'm here to try and make this project go smoothly for you. So that means that I'm going to be trying to help you find a hidden hawkwatch near you. So that means giving a brief overview of hawkwatching or hawk counting, with tips on searching for migrating raptors and locating your own hidden hawkwatch. I'll be giving a simplified overview of hawk counting data protocols, and I'll explain how to enter your data into hawkcount.org. And normally I'd have a Q&A session, but I'm not going to do that during this video. So to get started here, when a lot of us think of hawkwatching, we may imagine or even dream of images like this from Veracruz, where raptors can basically shade us out on a sunny day. Here further north, we may remember those few awesome days where time off work, the ephemeral bestial winds kind of finally come together, and we had a solid day of broad-winged hawk migration, as we're basically approaching right now in the third week of September. But a lot of times, hawkwatching is really more like this, right? One bird at a time, and rather distant at that. With practice, we're able to hone our skills and kind of see the essential characteristics, and eventually we're able to boil that down to really identifying what it is, like this adult northern goshawk that I saw one of my hidden hawkwatches last fall, and managed to take this just awful photo of. Likewise, when we think of Hawkwatch sites, we may think of pretty well-organized spots with a lot of infrastructure, educational opportunities, and really good company from the camaraderie of a lot of the hawkwatchers and birders that we know locally. And in a lot of ways, maybe this was one of the few sites where we all get to convene every once in a while. We may even think of big crowds looking in multiple directions, chatting about what's over here and what's over there, helping each other see and learn each bird. And if you've never had that experience, I highly recommend heading to an established hawkwatch near you sometime to learn, to share, to teach, and really to explore and experience raptor migration together. But hawkwatching can also look like this, and has for me and much of my career. One or two people toiling away with few visitors, eating hastily prepared lunches, and progressively wearing all the layers in your wardrobe as it gets colder later in the season. In this case, my friend Neil and I were scouting for a new hawkwatch site up in the Yukon Territory. And we spent most days in a different spot, honing in on what we hoped would eventually kind of be the spot over the course of essentially an entire season of hawkwatching. Now, these are all great versions of hawkwatching, and they suit different people's energy levels, their attention spans, and their need for solitude or social engagement that we may not get in our regular lives or in our regular birding. For the moment, though, I'd like you to hold on to this idea of counting alone or with a small team and looking for something that you're not really quite sure is there, because that's really more in line with the goals of this project. So we've invited you all to join this project to look essentially for new hawkwatch sites, to take a weekend away from the long-term monitoring sites that we love or our usual general birding hotspots and focus on describing and counting raptor migration at novel spots, to celebrate migration in kind of a different way. Or for some folks, we're encouraging them to share what's right in their own backyards or potentially their favorite birding spot with a broader community. But because of these different ideas of what hawkwatching is, we may all have slightly different expectations or even different search images of what we're looking for when we go out looking for a hawkwatch. And it's good to kind of try to break down some of those preconceptions a bit before we actually go out and try to do that. So 3 years ago, while on a lunch break doing plant surveys, I found this just wonderful spot at the Forks of the Credit Provincial Park, about an hour north of Toronto. As a longtime hawkwatcher, I really couldn't miss this trickle of migrant raptors that I was seeing kind of out of the corner of my eye, or occasionally, literally while doing plant surveys, while looking at the ground and just being an ecologist for the day. And last year, I finally spent some focused time there and really kind of confirmed it as what I considered like a hidden hawkwatch. And I felt inspired to look for more of these and to start this project. So through those efforts, I tried lots of sites, many of which kind of challenged my own assumptions about what raptors will or won't migrate over. And while some spots were certainly better than others, and none were really dead ringers for kind of this next amazing big hawkwatch site in Ontario, I learned a lot about my community, and I learned that while raptors may not forage or breed everywhere, because I had a pretty good sense for raptor breeding habitat and raptor foraging habitat, I learned that while raptors may not breed or forage everywhere, they're really pretty capable of migrating over just about anything that we can build or potentially destroy on the ground. I was astounded to see them migrate right past high rises and the CN Tower, thermal off of rail yards, grocery store parking lots, seemingly follow transmission line corridors as part of their migratory routes. I found that the usually recommended sites along the shores of Lake Ontario were productive too, but more and more I wanted to see what was happening inland when the north winds weren't blowing and when the raptors were clearly still migrating, though perhaps in a more dispersed fashion, right? Not quite so concentrated. So for the Great Lakes Hawkwatch, We've already had registrations from folks planning to count from their balconies, from old landfills, restored wetlands, farm fields, and their own backyards. And I personally find that really inspiring. But it also makes it tricky to give people advice, right, on where to go and look for a hawkwatch. And so I think it's worth clarifying what actually at its core really makes a good hawkwatch and what doesn't, because you can waste a lot of time looking around for one and not really finding one, frankly. So what is hawkwatching, right? And what isn't? And I'll try to keep this brief, but hawkwatching is a stationary raptor count of raptors passing on a clear migratory route. Now, in the fall, for us here in the Great Lakes, that generally means the birds are moving from north to south or northeast to southwest. Occasionally, depending on your location, say if you're up in the Beach Peninsula, they might be moving northwest to southeast. Or if you are, say, here in Toronto, they might really be moving more in a pretty common east to west direction. So it can vary based upon location, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But the important thing is that the birds are moving in a direct, if not always consistent, they're moving in a direct flight path. And you can see that over a long distance, right? Over a few miles as they cover distance. That's very different from a foraging bird moving around or a local bird still on a territory that might be transiting from one part of their territory to the next. So, and if you're a beginner and you're hawk watching, you really are just focused on raptors. And I know that's tough at this time of year for a lot of folks and for a lot of experienced birders especially. But if you're new to hawk watching, I really strongly encourage you to just focus on the raptors. And depending on your skill level, right, when you're hawk watching, your first steps are basically going to be to ID to the group, right? Is it a buteo? Is it a falcon? Is it an accipiter? Is it an eagle? Or potentially a harrier, or an osprey, or a vulture. And then as we get better, as both our birding skills and our hawk watching skills improve, right, a lot of us are already probably at this stage, we're able to identify those birds to species. And then gradually, as our skills improve even more, we're able to start distinguishing potentially sex or age plumages, depending on the species, or even potentially color morphs if you're maybe out west where you've got lots of dark morph redtails, lots of dark morph ferruginous hawks or Swainson's hawks that are really polymorphic species. You may be able to kind of identify those and define them a little bit better. When we're hawk watching, we are describing the flight characteristics. So we would be documenting the vertical height the birds are passing at and the horizontal distance that they're passing relative to our particular hawkwatch site. And we're also describing the weather, right? So that we're going to get into the details of what weather might be collected a little bit later, but just as a sampling, you might be talking about, what types of clouds you're seeing, what the cloud cover is like, what the wind direction and speed is like, and documenting, basic precipitation, kind of pretty basic weather summaries of a site, but oftentimes data that you can't easily collect from simple weather sources, or at least you couldn't 20 years ago when a lot of these protocols were developed. Now, the flight characteristics and weather descriptions are optional for the Great Lakes Hawkwatch. And we did that because we really wanted to try to make the project accessible to more people and not have folks get bogged down in collecting some of that data while they were out potentially hawkwatching for some of their first times. But for folks that are relatively experienced and relatively used to collecting that kind of data, we certainly still encourage you to do so. Now, hawkwatching is not counting local raptors, foraging raptors, or roosting raptors. And that's really important, right? We all kind of know lots of spaces that we can go and we can see local red tails. We can see birds that breed or winter in our areas and may still be on those territories hanging out. Some of those birds may even interact with migrants as they pass through because they're still rather territorial. But when we're hawkwatching, we really have to be careful to distinguish between local birds, and true migrants. And to that end, hawkwatching is not driving a transect or walking around a birding spot. So you really are stationary, but sometimes when you're scouting for a potential hawkwatch site, you may well be spending quite a bit of time walking around or even driving, looking for the flight. So, we've already learned a great deal about raptor migration, especially in the Great Lakes, and that knowledge should inform our efforts to learn more. Looking at data from the established hawkwatches has informed the selection of the dates for this project, which for this year was essentially aimed at detecting peak broad-winged hawk migration. Data from those historic hawkwatches, the larger ones of which are shown here, combined with data from banded or telemetered birds, shows that these birds are really migrating across this entire landscape, but they're concentrating along the corridors that are shown here. And the arrows are roughly drawn to scale, roughly, for the volume of birds that's moving along through them. But birds really are moving across the entire landscape, right? So if we look up at the Mackinac Straits at the north end of mainland Michigan, there's birds coming through the Mackinac Straits there, about 20 to 30,000 each year, and they're going to continue going south. They're going to potentially spread out across Michigan, but on some weather conditions, they might be concentrated at the western portion of Michigan or the eastern portion or somewhere in between. So when we look for a new hawkwatch site, right, we should be positioning ourselves facing this expected direction of the flight and scanning or searching for raptors in front of us and to either side. So what do I mean when I say that? Well, a good hawkwatch day can feel a bit like kind of a slow motion version of hyperspace from Star Wars or from Star Trek, right? Where you basically have birds passing all around you on slightly different trajectories, but they're all basically going the same direction, right? Towards you if you're at a good hawkwatch on a good day. Now, I say for the most part, certainly because turkey vultures and broadwings can kind of form these classic kettles where large groups are essentially thermaling up in front of us and then passing over on pretty similar trajectories. But that's really kind of the exception in a lot of ways. Most of our migrant raptor species really are moving through in ones and twos, and they're doing so in pretty variable trajectories. So, depending on the site and optics, the flight might actually be spread out over approximately 6 to 12 kilometers. The truth is detecting birds much beyond that really becomes pretty difficult. And unless you're a pretty advanced hawkwatcher with a spotting scope, who really knows the site quite well, I think it's pretty challenging. I think most people would agree it's pretty challenging to really detect and properly identify birds, much beyond that distance. Now, at a long-term monitoring site, you've basically got to stay put wherever you are, right? If you're the hawk counter for the day, you've got to stay there for the day. You get to see visitors come and go who can come and leave for, an hour or two at a time and leave when the flight gets boring or leave when they have other commitments. But if you're the counter for the day, you have to stay there regardless of what's going on with the flight. And that's part of the value of those long-term monitoring sites is that we have a person or multiple people counting all day, every day for, maybe 2 months or potentially up to 3 or 3.5 months at some sites. But the great thing with scouting or looking for new hawkwatches is that you can chase the flight in either direction while still trying to face the flight. So what I mean by that is that if you're at a hawkwatch site and it looks like all the birds are just way over to one side, right, you can actually move over and try to chase the flight and try to put yourself closer to them. So if you're out and you're seeing all those birds, 15, maybe maybe 10 kilometers away. You can tell they're really, really far. You're only getting to see maybe just a handful of them, but you kind of think maybe there's more that you're missing. Just go over there and try to find a new spot to count from. Likewise, if you're counting somewhere and all the birds are way off to the other side, well, you take a look at your map and you figure out maybe there's an observation point where there's a park 15 kilometers or even just 4 kilometers, the other direction, where I might be able to get a little bit closer and see those birds a little bit better. Again, we kind of call that chasing the flight, and it's sort of taboo at long-term monitoring sites. But when we're looking for new hawkwatch sites, it's just a regular part of what you might have to do in a day or over the course of a few days. So with some basic mapping and field visualizations of the predominant flight lines, and frankly, a fair amount of trial and error, you can hone in on a spot that basically is in the middle of the flight most of the time. And that's what we did here in the Yukon Territory, where we eventually settled on the best spot. So we spent some time over here at the Meadow site, and we saw birds, kind of flying a bit to our north. We spent some time here, what we call the South Shore spot, and we saw a lot more birds flying right overhead and much closer to us, but we were still able to see some of the more distant birds. So it's a trial and error process, but eventually you kind of position yourself in the sweet spot. So learning these experiences are typically what prompt these hilariously long-winded descriptions from veteran hawkwatchers about when you should or shouldn't visit a site. The truth is that very, very few hawkwatch sites were actually kind of easy to find. They generally required hours, days, or even weeks of scouting to hone in on. And we really shouldn't expect finding smaller hawkwatch sites to be particularly easy either. But the goals of it are basically the same. So I would say there are some commonalities. The two major ones that people generally point to is that there are major landforms that operate to concentrate the flight. Now, here in the Great Lakes, we generally consider those to be impassable bodies of water, right? The Great Lakes themselves are their own deterrent. Most raptor species don't want to fly over open water. If they are willing to fly over open water, it's still not a very efficient way of getting where they want to go, and it's potentially a costly or even dangerous one to do so. So they're generally going to move with those, what we call leading lines, and move along those. Likewise, at more local scales, local landforms can provide consistent thermals, potentially updrafts, or both. Now, a lot of my experience hawkwatching is in the West, where we have these long north-south running mountain ranges, and they're really the classic example. So you get a southwesterly or westerly wind that hits this long north-south running ridge line, and it creates this current of air. And the raptors can kind of move down that current of air a bit like a surfer moves down a wave, very, very effortlessly in a lot of ways, and very, very efficiently cover long distances. Likewise, some of those mountains can create thermals, right? Hot air rising, and raptors use that as well. Well, there's a little bit less of that here in Ontario, but there are certainly still sites across the landscape that create thermals. And raptors will certainly use that. And like I said, I've seen birds here using parking lots that have thermals, rail yards, these areas where you have consistently hot air rising, can still give the birds the lift that they need to move efficiently. So we generally have good visibility facing the flight and to either side of us if we can. So what that means is that there are relatively few trees and buildings or obstructions to that view on the landscape. And so we want to try to look for places that give us that good kind of panoramic view if possible, or if not panoramic, then at least good in the direction facing the flight. It's really important that we have a safe spot to stand for long periods of time, right? So We don't want to be in places that are really close to roadsides because that's just dangerous, and I really strongly discourage anybody from doing that. Um, we want to ideally be on public property. Most of us don't own large enough pieces of property that we're able to hawkwatch on our backyards, but if we're lucky enough to, that's fantastic. But for a lot of us, we're looking for public property with large, expansive views that we can use to set up a site at. At good hawkwatch sites, I would generally describe the raptors as moving, directly overhead or potentially passing just to either side of just off track from overhead. So, and what that means is that you get good views of the birds. And in essence, you don't really require a spotting scope. Now, you'll certainly see people using spotting scopes at some of the big hawkwatch sites and some of the smaller ones alike. And they're handy every once in a while. They're very handy on some days in particular. But for a good hawkwatching site, I would say 80-90% of the birds on any given day, you don't need a scope to view them. You can identify them and see them very well with binoculars. And likewise, on 80-90% of the days, you really don't need a scope at all either. It's really just for kind of some of those outlier days where the birds are really far away. That you're inclined to kind of need one. And the reality of it is that I actually think hawkwatching is quite a bit easier without a scope. You are able to detect a lot more birds instead of getting really kind of myopic in your spotting scope and looking at one bird for 10 minutes trying to figure out what it is. A lot of times when you're doing that, you might miss 4 or 5 other birds that are passing right overhead. So I generally encourage people to look for sites that they can just use their binoculars at, or naked eye detection, preferably. So over time, microsite weather interactions are learned, and the flight becomes somewhat predictable relative to certain winds, major weather systems, and air pressure systems. And like I sort of said earlier, learning these experiences really are what makes the veteran hawkwatchers at a site kind of talk your ear off about when you should come out. And that's because they've spent an awful lot of time doing it, and they may want to be trying to save you some time by giving you all the data that they've figured out in their minds anecdotally over the years that create good or bad flight conditions at that site. Because it really is kind of complicated and quite variable by what site you're at. So how to find a hidden hawkwatch, right? So here's some of my tips for how to do that. And these are just some of the ones I've found work for me. I'm sure that there are others that work for other folks. One of my most important ones, I would say, generally is that sharp-shinned hawks, and to a lesser extent ospreys, they really kind of define the flight line, especially first thing in the morning. And what I mean by that is that sharp-shinned hawks are gregarious, right? They're a little bit more used to hanging out with each other because they're kind of feisty and pissy with each other, so they find each other on migration. They're essentially present throughout the migration season. Certainly, they follow a bell curve throughout the season, but they're generally detectable throughout the season. And they often fly a lot lower than other species do. So if you start off hawkwatching in the morning, you can often find sharp-shinned hawks moving or kestrels moving earlier in the season. And that can tip you off to the presence of a migration moving right over that spot. And as the birds start getting higher, you can then follow where the sharpshins are moving and start detecting other species along the way. Now, why is that important? Well, it's great on a day-to-day basis of looking for the flight if you're out there, but it's also great from a data perspective, right? So I use eBird to search for places with large sharp-shinned hawk concentrations, or potentially, in this area, large broad-winged hawk concentrations. That might seem like cheating, but the truth is it's not. We've all, or many of us have been contributing eBird data for quite a few years, and there's a wealth of data out there to use to our advantage of people that may have been birding somewhere and incidentally seen 3 or 4 or 10 sharp-shinned hawks passing over. They counted it in their daily check sheet um, while counting all the other birds that they were out there counting. And that gets recorded in eBird. And if you have a little bit of patience and you're looking at a localized area, say 50 kilometers square, 50 kilometer by 50 kilometer area, you can find little concentration points where people have basically done some of the hard work for you. I would generally encourage people to start relatively early, maybe not early by birding standards, but kind of early by hawk watching standards. So try to start at around 8 or 9 a.m. and move along a line, preferably a road, that runs perpendicular to that expected flight direction. And then periodically scan or search for migrants by facing the flight. So what I mean by that is that you might pick like a 15 or 20 kilometer stretch of road, and you might stop 4 or 5 times along that stretch of road, say every 4 or 5 kilometers, and scan for 30 minutes or an hour or so and see if you can detect a migration. And of course, you'll want to do that by facing that expected direction of the flight. And so for this project, I'm kind of encouraging folks to basically pick an intended site. So have a spot in mind that you're going to start your day off hawk watching at, and give it a good effort until noon, 1 o'clock, say. And if you don't have any luck, then you might try this technique where you strike off, say, north or south along a line perpendicular to the flight, and stop periodically. The caveat there is that now it's 1 o'clock and the birds are undoubtedly going to be higher in the middle part of the day. So you're going to want to be scanning and looking quite a bit higher yourself. So now let's go back to this map and think about all the areas that we really don't know very much about, but where we know that raptors are still migrating through. Think about where we live and where we plan to look for migrants away from these traditional sites. So if you're counting from the lakeshore, it may be helpful to start near the water and work inland from there, or potentially start inland and move towards the water. If you're counting inland, though, and you know you're going to be inland for the entire day, as we are across much of the province, it's probably best to find somewhere with a good panoramic view. Try to find somewhere high elevation in a nice, clearing with not a lot of trees around, and that really will be your best bet. So other basic tips for finding a hidden hawkwatch. There's some overlap here with just basic hawkwatching tips. Find higher ground wherever possible. Again, look for somewhere with a good panoramic view. Count with a friend or partner. This really, really is important. Whether you're recording data or looking at a migrant raptor yourself, having more pairs of eyes looking for migrant raptors is always helpful. This is part of why we have 10 or 15 people at big hawkwatch sites sometimes, because on a really big day, you're really glad you had 10 or 15 people looking. But when you're just looking for one yourself, doing it solo really is quite challenging. So, even if that means recruiting someone who's not particularly experienced, I think it's well worth it. And from a safety perspective, I think it's always safer in the field to have a partner with you out there. So count with a friend or partner if you can. If you don't have somebody to count with, then feel free to let us pair you up. We're working to do that as quickly as we can here, to pair up mentors with mentees or vice versa. I strongly encourage people to wear polarized sunglasses. I think it really helps, especially on a day with bright sunshine and potentially clear blue skies. The birds really do jump out at you just a little bit more, especially when they're quite high. The other important thing, I think, is to relax your eyes. Now, The easiest way to kind of explain that is to think back to those Magic Eye 3D puzzles, right? Kind of think about how you have to relax your eyes a little bit to see those. If you're one of those people that just can't make that work, I'm sorry. But that's partly what you're doing when you're hawk watching. And mentally, if you've been to a hawkwatch site and you've kind of had that aha moment when you finally started seeing all the raptors that everybody else that was there was already seeing, try to think back to that moment, because that moment was basically when you learned to relax your eyes, to stop looking at the dragonflies that are moving over 100 meters above your head, and to stop looking at the passerines that are moving over, at variable heights, to relax your eyes and start picking out raptors that are going to be a little bit higher on the landscape or potentially moving faster across that landscape. Visit a hawkwatch beforehand. It really helps amazing amount to visit a hawkwatch beforehand, to retrain your eyes to what that relaxed feeling feels like, to think while you're at that hawkwatch. Okay, I'm here at a hawkwatch. I'm seeing birds. They're moving here, here, and here. When I'm out looking for a new hawkwatch, I have to have that same level of vigilance, essentially, of kind of looking for new birds and kind of having your head on a swivel, looking for birds at lots of different directions, and kind of looking like a crazy person, but that's how you find them, right? Study your raptor ID beforehand. I think it's really valuable to do that. And I think that you'll all benefit from it. The less time that you're out in the field looking, I think it'll be really, really valuable. Okay, so now for the fun stuff. This is what everybody was hoping for, the count protocol overviews. So, essentially good data needs basic protocols. We are conducting community science here, often called citizen science. And while some people may think that the data standards for community science are lower than for sort of more classic rigorous science, I would argue that it's not. It's still quite rigorous. It needs to be. And when we kind of keep that in mind, that we're participating in a data collection initiative here, one way that I think helps with that is to think of data really telling a story. So a hawkwatcher can take a look at your hawkwatch data from a day, and they can really see the story. If the data is collected relatively properly, they can really see the story of how your day unfolded. And so I think it's worth keeping that in mind as we are out there collecting data. So the most important thing is to record the location of your count. And you can do that while you're out in the field by using a reliable address, by using the latitude, longitude on your phone or potentially on your GPS unit. And trying to really keep a good, accurate location of where you are. We're going to be using what we call local standard time. So that's 1 hour behind what is on your watch or phone right now if you look at it, right? We generally right now are operating on daylight savings time, unless you are in one of these far-flung provinces up north that isn't observing daylight savings time. Most of us here in Ontario certainly are. So for hawkwatch data, though, we use standard time, and that's because we're collecting data over a time span that includes the before and after when daylight savings time ends. So we're using local standard time, and that's 1 hour behind what's on your watch or phone. We are conducting a stationary count. I can't emphasize that enough. You got to stay in a stationary count. And you're collecting a tally of each species of bird or each type of bird that you see for each hour. And we are not counting locals, right? We're only counting clear migratory species and migratory birds. And, knowing your locals can help a lot with that. So if you scout a site and you know that there's a local pair of red tails or a local pair of Cooper's hawks that are, kind of regulars around there, it can make the day easier knowing what those birds are. And it can also make it easier when you really see a clear migrant to know that bird is clearly migrating. I picked it out, 3 miles out to my north, and I followed it all the way, and it kept on going, and it's still flying 2 miles south of me. That bird's a migrant, right? Get in the habit of kind of doing that and refreshing yourself of what a migratory flight line looks like. So species are identified to the best of your ability. So it's important to stay humble. And what I mean by that is that we've created codes, we've had these codes for decades, that allow us to identify to group. So you might only be able to identify to the buteo level or to the accipiter level, right? So you know that it's a buteo, you know that it's either a red-tailed hawk or a red-shouldered hawk or a broad-winged hawk, or potentially a rough-legged hawk, but you know that it's not a sharp-shinned hawk, a Cooper's hawk, or a goshawk, right, our accipiters. Likewise, you may know that you saw an eagle, but you're not sure whether it was a bald eagle or a golden eagle. So we've created these codes: unknown buteo, unknown accipiter, unknown eagle, unknown falcon, or potentially even just unknown raptor. And I'll come back to that in a second. But using these codes really is completely fine. And good hawk watchers know when they just can't tell. Sometimes a bird's too far away. Sometimes you didn't see it for very long, or you didn't get a very good look at it, or the lighting was really bad. And you just know that you really can't tell. So you should generally know that you are counting a raptor, that you are not counting a gull and calling it a raptor, that you're not seeing a crow or a raven and calling it a raptor. But occasionally you may see a bird say that you're not sure if it is an eagle or a vulture, and that's perfectly acceptable to mark that bird as an unknown raptor. Or you might see a bird that you're not sure whether it's a buteo or an accipiter. Maybe you saw a goshawk, and it's pretty darn confusing for some people when they first see a goshawk to be sure whether that was a buteo or an accipiter, because they fly similarly to both of those groups, depending on the bird and the situation. So you might mark unknown raptor, and that really is just fine. Recording age or sex wherever possible are great. They're part of how we learn to be better hawk watchers and how we learn to be better birders. But they're really not required for hawk watching, and they're not required for this project. And I say that because it's important to get a total tally of the species more than it is to get a completely accurate list of every bird that you saw. So let me clarify that. We would rather that you counted all 2,200 birds that you saw that day, but only were able to identify 70% of them to the species level, than we would have you count 240 birds and miss the other 1,600 that were out there because every single bird that came through, you were trying to ID to the species level as best as possible. Now, that's kind of an extreme circumstance, but I will say from personal experience that when you spend 15 minutes trying to identify one bird, you definitely miss some other birds through the process. Like I said, flight description are given to each hour, and those are relative to the ground, and those really are optional for the Great Lakes Hawkwatch, as are the weather descriptions for each hour. So, what am I talking about with weather descriptions? Well, these are pretty basic data, and they're included in the protocols that are going to be sent to all of you for long-term monitoring sites. But we record basic precipitation, we record wind direction, we record cloud cover to the nearest 10% increment, and we record an estimate of visibility. Those are all really helpful data for figuring out what the weather looked like while you were out hawk watching for a day at your site. We would also be recording the wind on any given day, and there's the capacity to record these subjectively, so you don't necessarily have to have a fancy piece of weather equipment or a high quality weather station nearby you to get this weather. You can estimate a lot of it yourself. Likewise, we describe the flight itself while we're out there. And that's based upon the height that they pass you at. So if we think of raptors migrating past us, some of them might be passing, say if you're on the top of a mountain, they might be passing below you or below eye level. And some of them may be passing incredibly high. I won't go through all the codes. Luckily, this is a video, and if you want to pause it, you can. But basically, most of the birds are going to be existing between about 30 meters overhead and somewhere approaching the limit of your ability to detect them, whether that's with naked eye detection, and there's a code for that, or the limit of your binoculars ability to detect birds. There's a different code for that, right? So how high the birds are in the landscape is a valuable piece of data that we collect at long-term monitoring sites, but it is optional for this project. So the truth is there are dozens and dozens of field data collection forms that people have developed over the years, and we'll share some of those with registrants, and they can use one that works for them. The truth of the matter is when you're out in the field and you're trying to tally things on a piece of scrap paper, you kind of start realizing like, oh, I probably should have structured this a little bit more carefully. So we have a handful of those that we're going to share with you. But the primary data form that we use is this daily summary form that's shown here on the slide, and it's organized to make entering your data into HawkCount really easy, and that's because it has all the fields that require data already on them, and you can simply summarize the total of each species that you saw in a given hour on that form. So the links for these daily count forms are just PDFs have been emailed to everybody, and there's also a link for the full count protocols that would be used at a long-term monitoring site. Now, those really are quite dense. I will freely admit they're pretty dense, but just remember most of the stuff that's in there regarding weather and flight height descriptions are optional for this project. So now kind of to the meat of this for some folks. So getting data into HawkCount is actually pretty easy, and it can be done manually, or it can also be done with an app called Dunkadoo. Tonight we'll be giving a simple intro to putting data in manually, as that's still how most folks do it, and it's still how we generally encourage beginner hawkwatchers to do it. It's especially valuable because it gives you a permanent record of the data that you collected, and it really, someone can look at that data form and kind of read that story of your day. So I'll be giving a simple intro to how to do that, and also how to register your count site. But I'll be sending out detailed directions on how to register your new personal Hawkwatch site in a paper form as well, attached with what's sent out to you on this. So let's see. So for brevity's sake, right, to try to keep things short, let's say that I was out there counting somewhere for the first part of the day, and I just got skunked. I was totally not where the raptors were. I spent 4 hours and I didn't see squat. A diligent hawkwatcher will still record those zeros, and we certainly want all of you to do that as well. But showing you how to enter zero data is pretty boring. So let's pretend that I counted until 12 o'clock. I didn't see anything. I followed my own advice. I drove 7 miles to the north, and I checked a few spots along the way. And the third one, I finally found a flight of raptors, right? And at 12:50, I found this promising site. I quickly detected a flight. I set up shop to begin properly counting at 1 o'clock, and I felt comfortable with the data that I was collecting between 1 and 3 o'clock when the weather just went to crap and I got rained out for the day, right? Let's just pretend that's what happened to keep things simple. So what I'm going to do, and here's the sample data set that you can see. Oh, sorry. that I collected. So just 2 hours of counting, I managed to find a decent number of birds. So what I'm going to do is go to hawkcount.org. Now we're going to send you all a link for how to create an account in hawkcount.org. And that's the first thing that you're going to want to do is simply set up an account. Very simple login process for creating an account. And you're going to get an automatic email sent back to you to activate that account. This is a secure website, but it essentially operates similar to how a bank or to how Facebook might do it when you set up a new account with them. So you'll enter in your basic details. You'll get bounced back an activation link to the email address that you use. And then you'll go to HawkCount and you will log in. And you'll go over here and you'll land on the main landing page. You'll log in and then you'll go over here and you'll click data entry, right? And what that will give you the opportunity over here to do is click new site request. So you can click this tab over here, new site request, and it'll bring up this fantastic new opportunity to set up a personal Hawkwatch site. You're going to select the drop-down menu, select personal Hawkwatch. Do not select organized Hawkwatch, or you will be committing yourself to 20 years of hard work and potentially sleepless nights. For this project, you're going to want to just select personal Hawkwatch, and that's going to pull up this page. Now, you're going to select for the project, which is the Great Lakes Hawkwatch. You're going to give yourself a site name. So today I'm going to set up a site for the Humber Marshes Park here in Toronto. Now, it's best for a site name to pick something that's going to be really recognizable and really searchable on a map, right? We don't want to be picking something like John Doe's backyard or Jane's fabulous Hawkwatch site, because that's really confusing. If you're inclined to put your address on here, that's fine. But if for privacy reasons you do not want to put your address on there, that is absolutely fine as well. For your reference, your locations will not show up on a map in a public interface, and so your locations will not be divulged or easily searchable for somebody to protect people's security and privacy. For the site description, you're going to want to give a few details that are outlined on the document that I've sent you all. But for now, let's say this is a public city park with a parking lot nearby for the boat launch. The count is conducted facing east towards High Park, and the view is unobstructed to the north, northeast, east, and southeast, right? Just a basic description will do for now. This is something that you can edit later, so don't worry too much about getting it dialed in too much, but give a simple overview. You might list the habitat, you might list perhaps a very brief anecdote into how you found the site, but do keep those modest. You'll want to go ahead and click here. Is the site active during the spring season? Well, for this site, no, it's not. For most of us, that's going to be the case. Is the site active during the fall season? Well, it seems like it is, yes, because I just detected some migrants here. For this project, let's just go ahead and say that the site starts September 1st and ends October 31st. That's kind of our basic fall raptor migration window. We'll go ahead and we'll click, we'll leave the default time zone as Eastern Standard Time. Our sighting period was hourly. For a few of the truly new beginners to this effort, if you're out there and you are a total newbie to this and you're out on your own, it is okay to collect daily data, but we are strongly encouraging and asking everybody to do hourly data, as I have shown here. Time format is up to you, whether you want it to be 24-hour or 12-hour. Whatever works for you is fine. I'm a military time kind of guy, and we have a pre-selected suite of species on the Great Lakes Hawkwatch that are already dialed in for Great Lakes species. And it's important that you do select that. If you select raptors of Western North America, then it will tell you that it's perfectly normal to encounter a ferruginous hawk, which it really is not totally. It is really not expected to be seeing ferruginous hawks here in Ontario. So it'll help guide you somewhat similarly to how eBird guides you. But for this project, please do leave it on the Great Lakes Hawkwatch. Now we have this fantastic interface here. Our web developer, Jason Sodergren, has really done a fantastic job of putting this together. We've got this great web interface using Google Maps, excuse me. And so you have two options. You can either old school enter in the decimal degrees, the latitude and longitude, or the degrees, minutes, seconds for your site. Or if you can pick it out on a map, you can simply zoom into the site and I know the Humber Marsh Park pretty well. Maybe I don't know it terribly well on a street view, but I'm a satellite view kind of person. And here's my hidden Hawkwatch at the Humber Marshes Park. And all I've got to do is click on that. That's where I count from when I'm there. And lo and behold, it automatically uploads the decimal degrees, latitude, longitude, as well as the degrees, minute, second format of latitude and longitude in there for you. Holy smokes, that's amazing. So that is here in Toronto. That's in Ontario, Canada. And then you're going to go ahead and you're going to click on I am not a robot, and then you're going to hit Save Site Definition. So there you go. Site setup request received. Thank you. Site activation will be completed after review. Email will be sent when complete. What that means is that someone's going to manually review the site that you've input. And that's kind of an important security feature for us to make sure that it's a legitimate location. And so that'll probably generally happen relatively quickly, but it could take up to 48 hours or even longer potentially for that to get approved. So don't worry if that takes a day or two to get approved, but hopefully it'll be quicker than that. And then you can go ahead and you can do the data entry for a site. Now, I just entered that site in, so it's not an option yet for me to enter data for it. But let's go ahead and let's say that I want to enter data for one of my other sites that I've created already, that's already been approved, the Beary Hill Park. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go do some data entry, and I'm going to do it for the Beary Hill Hawk site. I'm going to hit Change Site right there. Let's go ahead and we'll use my local Hawkwatch site, Niagara Peninsula Hawkwatch, for this. And this is what's going to come up when your site is fully set up. You'll have your site listed across the top, and you're going to select your report date. So it's the first day of the Great Lakes Hawkwatch, or maybe the second day of the Great Lakes Hawkwatch, September 19th, 2021. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Retrieve, Enter Day's Data. Now, let's keep our data entry in mind here, we were counting from 2 to 4 daylight savings time, which is 1 to 3 Eastern Standard Time. So I started at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I finished at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So we've got these simple fields here. You can input a weather summary of your day. You can enter the observations of of raptor species that you saw. Just you can summarize them if you like. You can enter observations summarizing potentially other species that you saw, or visitors that you encountered or that joined you for the day. And if you're so inclined, you can even create next day's predictions on there. But most of this is really designed for long-term monitoring sites, and it's not terribly important that you do that for your hidden Hawkwatch site. So now I'm going to go ahead and proceed to step 2, count entry, and here we go. So you see all these wonderful drop-down menus for entering some of this weather data that we told you about. Again, this is optional for the Great Great Lakes Hawkwatch, and you don't need to worry about it. We even have some pretty advanced stuff. If you really want to geek out and put your barometric pressure in, you are free to do that as well. But if you just leave them blank, then that'll be fine for this project if that's how you're planning to do it. So I'll go ahead and I'll pick my name out of a list of official counters. Here, for your personal site, you are probably going to be the only person there, but you may also have potentially, your spouse or your partner or your son or daughter with you, or your dad. You can just enter them in over here as well, and tally how many observers you had with you. So I was there, and I was counting with my lovely wife Jade, and we both counted for 60 minutes for that hour, so there were one other additional observer there. Okay, so let's get to our data, right? So I had 24 turkey vultures, 1 osprey, 2 bald eagles, 6 sharp-shinned hawks, 1 Cooper's hawk, 17 broad-winged hawks, 9 red tails, 1 American kestrel, and 1 unknown accipiter, 1 unknown boodio, and even an unknown eagle. If you saw something particularly rare, this is where you might enter it. But just remember the standards for seeing something rare are pretty high. So we strongly would encourage photo documentation of any of the species that are on here. And it really is incredibly unlikely that you'll see any of those species during the count. But I know right now in Ontario there is a swallow-tailed kite around, and it's entirely possible that someone through this project could detect that bird, right? So the option's there to do it. Then we'll go ahead and we'll save this period's data, and Hawk Count's going to go to work, and it's going to tally up the totals for that hour. Then I'm going to go on to my second hour, and any data that I entered in from the prior hour is still going to be there. So I'm still the official counter. My wife Jade is still an additional observer with me. There's still 1 additional observer here with me. In our notes, you can say weather started to get stormy, but was able to count until 1500 before it was unsafe. Yeah, something like that would be great. And we can go to our next hour of data here. We've got 38 turkey vultures, 1 bald eagle, 14 sharp-shinned hawks, 2 Cooper's hawks, 34 broadwings, 11 red-tailed hawks, 1 merlin, 2 bootios, and 1 unknown raptor, right? A little rusty, no problem. Had an unknown raptor. It happens to the best of us. Save this period's data, and there we go. And it's given me a total during that period as well. Now it knows that I only counted for 2 hours, so it's going to tell me to proceed to step 3, review finalize data. And just let my internet work here. There we go. And it gives you this wonderful summary of your day. It also gives you hourly summaries of your day. So you should be proofing that against your field data form and making sure that that data is all correct, right? And if it's not, then you can simply click over here and go back to one of those hours and make the adjustments accordingly. So I'll go back to my review data tab here, and basically this is all geared towards accurate data collection. So it might seem a little redundant, like there's some fail-safes in there, and truthfully there are some fail-safes in there. We want accurate data collection. So once I've reviewed all that, I can proceed to step 4. There's some stuff in here for long-term monitoring sites that you guys aren't going to have to deal with at a personal Hawkwatch site. But essentially from there, you'll be able to finalize your data and potentially even print out a summary report of your day, right? And some of you that are familiar with Hawk Count already probably have seen these for other long-term monitoring sites, but there's your data all nice and laid out for you, and it should match what's on your field data form. So, once that's all tickety-boo, you just go ahead and hit finish submission and send reports. And I'm actually not going to do that today because I don't want to create a bogus report for my awesome Hawkwatch over at Beamer Conservation Area, but that would be the next step. So that mostly concludes, the data entry portion of things. Like I said, we've sent out a mailer with all of these details to all of you, and so it should be relatively smooth. I'll just go back to my presentation here. Some final details here. Project registration closes soon, so if you somehow are watching this and you haven't registered yet, please do. The whole process can all start by creating your Hawk Count account at this site, hawkcount.org/register.php, and things kind of unfold from there. With that, I'd like to just thank all the wonderful folks on the Great Lakes Hawkwatch Organizing Committee that have helped to pull this project together, and all the wonderful organizational partners that have made it possible. Some of these folks maybe have already been in touch with you, or maybe you know them from your local Hawkwatch. So if you do, please thank them for their efforts. Like I said, my name is Rob Spall, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to direct them to me at spall.robert@gmail.com. And thank you all for registering. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your Hawkwatch. I think we're going to have a great event, and I'm really excited to see all the data that everybody collects. So thanks very much.